I am Tamara Hedges. I'm the Executive Director at the University of Riverside Palm Desert Center. As I said, we have quite a few people, over 280 people registered for tonight's event. So that tells me that I am not alone in wanting to learn more about snakes and appreciating snakes. So again, I'm very excited that we have Paisley with us here this evening. I would like to start out with our UCR land acknowledgement. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Lasueño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, staff, and students, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work on these homelands. Okay, another little thing I just want to say about Paisley, and she'll probably plug this too, but she has one of the best Facebook groups around, and it is called the Palm Springs Reptile Appreciation Group. And you will see some of the most fantastic photos of snakes that you've ever seen in your life, other reptiles too, not just snakes, but lizards and all sorts of creatures, the best you've ever seen. So check that out, join that group if you haven't already. Okay, I want to thank absolutely from the bottom of my heart all of our UCR Palm Desert Center partners, without whom we could not have this event or any of the events that we have. It's because of your generous support that we are able to have these community lectures and activities, films, workshops, symposiums, all because of you. Thank you for your generous support. You enable us to keep these events free and open to everyone. I would also like to thank our Wild Coachella committee. We're a small but mighty team. It's myself and Cameron Barrows, Colin Barrows, who is a UCR Palm Desert Center climate steward and California naturalist, Elizabeth Erickson, who is also a UCR Palm Desert Center California naturalist and climate steward, Maggie Downs from our staff, and Amy O'Neill from our staff. So thank you for all of your work, all that you do to make this lecture series possible. As we said at the last Wild Coachella, we're hoping we can do this once a month. And that's our commitment, because we think it's really important that we get the word out about all of the wonderful things that are happening, the research that's happening, and the work that's being done here in the Coachella Valley and beyond to protect our natural world. So I think most of us now have the Zoom protocols down. Use the chat as though you are chatting. Share any information that you'd like with the panelists or with the entire group here. As I said, there's quite a few of us, so just share your thoughts and ideas, and if there's any resources you want to share there. For the Q&A, please put your questions in the official Q&A, and Colin Barrows at the end of Paisley's presentation will be managing that Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague and my friend, Dr. Cameron Barrows from UCR's Center for Conservation Biology.
Reason my video is not showing up.
Yeah, I don't see you. We hear you. Maybe if we can have Kelly or Agam start your video. I cannot.
It's not giving me the option, but I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Paisley Ramstad. She and I met probably about almost 10 years ago. She was a student in one of my courses that I was teaching at College of the Desert at the time. And in my experiences at College of the Desert, every once in a while, and it was not too rare, but every once in a while, I would get a student that just was really special, who had a spark of interest and intelligence and passion for the environment. And Paisley was one of those rare commodities. And I was very pleased then, just in the last couple of years, to be able to hire her and have her on our staff as a biologist doing work here in the Coachella Valley as part of our Center for Conservation Biology team that we are centered or housed at the Palm Desert campus. Paisley right now, when the wind isn't blowing too hard, is working out on the sand dunes, trying to help us do surveys of insects and reptiles out on the sand dunes. And if you're interested in helping her with that, you should definitely contact us, and we'll contact you and make sure you have a chance to do that. But without further ado, I want to bring Paisley on and let her talk about snakes, which she is incredibly passionate about. So Paisley, take it over.
All right, here we go. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to my presentation, Coachella Valley, a pit of snakes. I'm hoping today to tell you a little bit about why I sort of view the Coachella Valley as a pit of snakes and why I think this is something that we should be excited about and not afraid of. My PowerPoint does not, there we go. Quick introduction, who am I? I'm a lifelong Palm Springs resident. I'm a College of the Desert student in the Natural Resources Department, field biologist for UCR's Center for Conservation Biology, as well as a field technician for USGS out on our wind farms. More recently, I'm the creator and admin of the Palm Springs Reptile Appreciation page on Facebook, which I started last year as sort of a response to the growing number of reptile identification questions that were popping up in other neighborhood groups. And I'm a big fan of reptiles my whole life since 1990, and especially snakes. So as you can see here, this is a photo of me at 4 years old showing off a blind snake that I dug out of the yard, much to the dismay of my parents. A little bit about where we are. The Coachella Valley sits sort of in the middle of Riverside County. And although people tend to associate us with the nearby Mojave Desert and Joshua Tree, the Coachella Valley is technically in the Colorado Desert, which I've sort of haphazardly circled here in red. And the Colorado Desert is a subdivision of the greater Sonoran Desert. So the Mojave Desert we think of as the Joshua Tree Desert, and then the Sonoran Desert is your sort of classic Southwestern landscape with the big saguaro cactus. Our placement between these two larger deserts gives us a really unique landscape that is capable of supporting a real cool abundance of wildlife, and this is especially true of reptiles. What makes a snake? I am not a taxonomist, so I'm not going to get too heavy into snake biology, but I think there's some good things to know. That's that snakes are reptiles under the order Squamata, which encompasses all lizards and snakes, among others. Snakes are cold-blooded, they're scaly, they're diverse, and they're found in every state in the United States except for Alaska, and I say kind of, sort of Hawaii. Hawaii is home to the Brahminy blind snake, but it is not a native species there. It's been introduced. A question I get frequently is, how are snakes different from lizards, since we have so many of both here? So snakes have ocular scales instead of eyelids. This means they cannot wink or blink at us. They have no legs, not even one, whereas we know that lizards have typically 4, but sometimes fewer legs. Snakes have no external ear openings. If you look closely at the side of the head of this iguana versus this rosy boa, the iguana has a clear external ear opening and the boa does not. And in the Coachella Valley, snakes tend to be more nocturnal or active at night, while lizards are more diurnal and active during the day. There are, of course, some exceptions, but we typically expect to see lizards running around when we're hiking in the morning and snakes when we're out at night. And in my professional and completely unbiased opinion, snakes are cuter. Sorry, Dr. Barrows. Why do snakes matter? Why should we care? Snakes are secondary consumers, which means that they eat primary consumers like rodents and invertebrates, but also that they can be eaten by tertiary consumers like coyotes and hawks and bobcats. So they're really crucial to a healthy desert ecosystem because they are a central link in that food chain. Rodents and small mammals are much more likely than snakes to transmit zoonotic diseases to humans, carry Lyme-ridden ticks, and they're responsible for millions of dollars of crop and property damage in California alone every single year. So we want rodents to have as many predators as possible because we know that rodents breed very frequently and they repopulate super fast. On the flip side of that, when coyotes and other tertiary consumers have enough native prey to sustain themselves, they're less likely to encroach on neighborhoods to seek supplementary food sources like trash or, God forbid, small pets. So having a healthy snake population is beneficial to us. We have to remember that people are in fact part of this ecosystem. We are not separate from it. Where are snakes? Luckily for me, they are pretty much everywhere, but most snake sightings in the Coachella Valley happen on trails and in preserves and parks where there's a lot of natural habitat. So think places like the Indian Canyons in Palm Springs, Whitewater Preserve, the Living Desert, or on any of our hundreds of miles of beautiful hiking trails. But if you live near the base of a mountain or near some open desert, you might be lucky enough to spot one in your yard. Some herpers, which is a term for people who go out specifically to look for and observe reptiles, find snakes by slowly driving down desert roads at night because many snakes will come into the road to bask on asphalt as it retains heat better than their natural substrate, or to move between habitats as roads tend to cut between different habitats like hillsides and riparian areas. To hold or not to hold. Reptiles are unique, they're often relatively easy to catch, and they can be handled in a way that's minimally invasive to the animal. This is neat and it offers us a lot of opportunities to learn from hands-on experiences, but doesn't mean that we can or should freely handle any animal we can capture. I don't typically advocate for people going out and catching reptiles as much as they can. However, we know that abstinence-only education does not work, and you're going to see a lot of photos in this presentation of snakes in my hand. So if you choose to do as I do and not as I say, here's some things to consider to make reptile handling safe. First and foremost is, can I identify it? We know that some snakes are venomous. If you cannot identify an animal and you cannot be certain that it's not venomous, don't pick it up. Is it legal? In the state of California, to legally hold any native reptile, you need a sport fishing license. If you have a sport fishing license and you find a snake, you need to be sure that you are not on a protected land, such as a park or a refuge. If you have your fishing license and you're on land that you know is not protected, you need to be certain that that species is not protected. All of these laws are put in place to help protect our snakes and protect our ecosystems, so we want to abide by them as much as possible. Next is, can I catch or handle it without harming it or myself? A lot of times snakes will see us and they'll dive under a bush. A lot of desert bushes are very spiky. Unlike us, the snakes don't have the privilege of going home and washing their hands. So if any scrapes that these snakes get in our attempt to catch them, they have to carry with them through the habitat. Then is the animal eating, gravid, or otherwise vulnerable, or will I be interrupting a behavior that is crucial to that animal's survival? You can see here, there's a photo of a glossy snake choking down a pocket mouse. When I found this snake, we were really lucky that we were on a road that is not heavily trafficked. So we were able to keep a safe distance from the snake, watch it finish its meal, and make sure it got out of the road without ever having to touch the animal. Snakes don't eat as often as we do. They work really hard for every meal. So we want to make sure that that process is uninterrupted and that we don't force them to regurgitate a meal. Am I afraid of being bitten, musked, or pooped on? Snakes have a lot of defense mechanisms. Most of them are not pretty. If you're afraid of these things, even though most snake bites, especially here in the Coachella Valley, don't hurt, and getting pooped or musked is not a painful experience, if you're afraid of it, you might have a knee-jerk reaction that could cause you to harm the animal. And then lastly, what are your intentions with the animal? I'm a conservationist and an ecologist, so I have zero tolerance for mishandling, harming, or poaching animals. In my Facebook group, I will not allow the discussion of collection of animals, even when it's done legally, because I just think that wild animals should stay wild. This is a landscape that is already struggling. We're in a drought year. Every critter plays an important role. The question I get most frequently attached to every single snake identification thing that is sent my way is it a rattlesnake and should I be worried? The good news is that even if it is a rattlesnake, there's really not a lot of reason to worry. But to make it easier for everybody, we're going to talk about how we can recognize rattlesnakes from our non-venomous species. In the Coachella Valley and in all of California, The only snakes considered to be medically significant or dangerous to people are rattlesnakes. Luckily for us, rattlesnakes are really easy to identify from our many harmless species. So there's three key things we're going to look for. First is a triangle or diamond-shaped head that is distinct from the snake's neck and body. So you can see on this Sidewinder, I've circled the head, where you can see that very clear where the neck stops and the head starts. Next is keeled scales. This means that the scales overlap, giving the snake a scaled texture like you might expect to see on a dragon. And this keeled scale gives them a texture that's visible from a distance. So even if a snake is sort of under a bush or a little bit further away, you should be able to see some texture on those scales. And last but not least is the rattle. We know rattlesnakes get their name for a reason, but as you can see, this is a healthy adult Sidewinder that has a relatively small rattle. And these rules aren't perfect. You might not always have a clear view of the entire snake, so never ever handle or approach a snake you cannot confidently identify from multiple factors. There are 5 different species of rattlesnake that can be found in the Coachella Valley. These are the 2 that most frequently when people send me photos of rattlesnakes are seen. First is our Southwestern speckled rattlesnake. These guys are highly variable in color because they tend to always match almost perfectly the substrate where they're found. So whatever the ground looks like in the area where the snake is found, the snake is going to be those same colors. They have a speckled, kind of muddy pattern, and they're pretty widespread throughout the Coachella Valley, often seen on our hill-hugging trails. They are good climbers, so they like to be up in the rocks. Then we have our red diamond rattlesnake. These guys are beautiful, really large rattlesnakes that are a reddish-brown color. They have that distinct diamond pattern down their back that we tend to associate with rattlesnakes. They're pretty widespread, but we most typically see them near riparian habitat, and they are notoriously chill rattlesnakes. Red diamond rattlesnakes rarely even rattle at you. They couldn't be bothered by your presence. Sometimes it's frustrating for us as we are trying to move them out of the road because they just don't want to budge and they don't care that we are there. Then we have our Sidewinder. I think Sidewinders are probably one of our most abundant rattlesnakes in the Coachella Valley, but because of their habitat, I don't think they're seen as frequently by our average neighbor. So Sidewinders have a really distinct sidewinding movement that's kind of cool, so I've included a photo here of their tracks. They're widespread, but they prefer flat, sandy habitats. So when I'm working on sand dunes and in sand fields, we see these tracks all over the place, but you're not as likely to see them when you're hiking up one of our hillside trails. They're tan to white in color, and they're the only rattlesnake in the Coachella Valley that has these cute little horns above their eyes. And that's because they like to live in the sand. They like to shuffle just under the sand, and those horns help keep the sand out of their eyes. And then they're the smallest of our local rattlesnakes. And then last but not least, these are the 2 rattlesnakes that do technically exist in the Coachella Valley, but you are less likely to see. First is the Western Diamondback. These guys are really abundant east of the Coachella Valley. When you get into Arizona, they quickly become the most abundant rattlesnake, and they're a dime a dozen. They also have this distinct diamond pattern and can be variable in color from brown to tan to gray, and sometimes even a little bit green. But they have this high contrast black and white banded tail. Then we have our Southern Pacific rattlesnake, which is more abundant in higher elevations and cooler climates. So if you're hiking up into Idlewild, you might see one of these guys, or any of our trails that go from the valley floor up the mountains. As you gain elevation, you're more likely to see a Southern Pacific. They have a more rounded diamond pattern and are typically much darker than our usual rattlesnakes. They're brown to black in color, and you can see that their primary colors remain throughout their tail. So although they do have that banding on the tail, it's going to be whatever color the rest of the snake is, as opposed to this high contrast black and white. If you're lucky enough to spot a rattlesnake, here's what you can do to make this a safe, exciting experience. First is to stay calm. Rattlesnakes have no interest in hurting you. Venom is a really valuable resource, and the snake doesn't want to waste that resource on a defensive bite that's not going to provide a meal. Slowly move away from or around the snake, keeping an adequate distance so that the snake does not feel threatened. If the snake doesn't feel threatened, you're safe. Let other hikers that you pass know that you saw a rattlesnake and advise them to be extra aware of where they step. when we see a snake, it's easy for us to avoid it, but if we see somebody who has headphones in or is a trail runner, it's good to let them know, because if they're not paying as much attention as we are, that's how people get bit, is they step on a snake or they put their hands or feet somewhere where they can't see because they're just not paying as much attention. And then take a photo from a safe distance so you can share with us at Palm Springs Reptile Appreciation, and then celebrate. Spotting wildlife is a really exciting event, and I think we're so lucky here in the Coachella Valley that we can go on any one of our trails on any day of the year and almost expect to see something, whether it's a snake or a beetle or a bighorn sheep or a cottontail rabbit. There's always something out, and that's a privilege that a lot of people don't have. Many people hike for years without seeing a snake. So I want to kind of flip the script and have people realize that this is an exciting thing that we have the ability to do. It's not something that we need to be nervous about. In the extremely rare case that you are bitten by a rattlesnake, first of all, stay calm. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but rattlesnake bites in the United States are very, very rarely fatal when proper treatment is sought out. Call for medical assistance and get to a hospital as soon as possible. Again, we're pretty lucky in Palm Springs that the majority of our trails, you still get some sort of cell phone service, or you're not far from service. So get to where you can and then call for help. Do not use a snake bite kit, a tourniquet, ice, or attempt to suck out the venom. These are outdated and ineffective treatments. Currently, the only treatment for a rattlesnake bite in the United States is antivenom. So we do not want to waste any time or energy on outdated treatments. We just want to get to a hospital. And then don't worry about identifying the type of rattlesnake. Antivenom treatment is the same for all North American rattlesnakes, which means it doesn't matter if you're bit by a red diamond or a Sidewinder or a Southern Pacific. The amount of antivenom that you get is going to be determined by your body's reaction to the bite and not the type of snake. And then if you're on Facebook, the National Snakebite Support Group is a really incredible resource to help you through an active bite. If you happen to get bit, you go on, you post there, and they will immediately connect you with experts on rattlesnake bites and medical professionals who will help walk you through that medical process. This here is a red diamond rattlesnake that's in a defensive position, but I do want to say that a defensive position does not mean that it intends to strike. Most rattlesnakes that we see are going to be coiled under a shrub or possibly stretched out across the trail if they're basking. Rattlesnakes are not aggressive. They won't bite unless provoked. The only reason this one was even in a defensive position is because just before we found it, another car went right over the top of it. Luckily, the snake was not hit and we were able to move it to safety, but you can imagine that having a large vehicle go over the top of you would make you a little bit defensive as well. Another question I get frequently is people tell me that they saw a snake in the middle of the day and they thought they only came out at night and they're concerned. Does that mean that something is wrong with the snake? Should I try to catch it? Does it need help? And that's not the case. We have multiple diurnal species here that are more active during the day. First is our Coachwhip or Red Racer. These guys are a lightning fast snake. Typically you see them, it's like a red flash across the horizon because they're just so quick. They're really long, but pretty narrow-bodied snakes. They can get up to about 5.5 feet long. They like flat habitats, but they're not terribly picky. So they're frequently seen in and around neighborhoods. These are snakes that don't care if your lawn is perfectly manicured or if you have native plants grown. They'll be found just about anywhere. They're excellent climbers, so they can scale your walls with no problem. And they like to eat birds. So if you have a lot of trees or your yard attracts a lot of birds, you might be lucky enough to see a coachwhip in your yard as well. They're incredibly widespread throughout the southern United States, one of the most widespread snakes in the United States. And I just think they're very cool. I think they're probably the most commonly seen snake in the Coachella Valley because they tend to be out during the day and they're so boldly colored that when one is around, they're hard to miss. Then we have our gopher snakes. This one pictured is relatively small, but these are big snakes. As adults, they get between 2.5 and 9 feet long. I've never seen one quite that big here in the Coachella Valley, but in the Inland Empire, I've seen them about 6.5 feet long. And they're often confused with rattlesnakes, but they're completely harmless. They're great garden pest control. As their name suggests, they like to eat gophers and other small rodents. So if you are a gardener, and you see a gopher snake, you should absolutely encourage that snake to stick around. And they're also relatively widespread throughout the United States, particularly in California through Texas. And last of our diurnal species, or the last one featured today, is our patch nose. These are another super speedy, quick snake. They have this enlarged rostral scale or nose scale on the front of their face, which helps them navigate through sand, which is great for them because they're experts at finding burrows. More often than not, when you see a patch nose, by the time your brain has even registered that you're looking at a snake, it is halfway down a hole. It took me years to finally get one of these guys in hand. But they're pretty regularly seen on our desert trails. And then we have a lot of misidentifications in the Coachella Valley of when something is a king snake, and everybody says, oh, it's a king snake, they keep the rattlesnakes away. But the truth is that what's black and white and sometimes red all over in the Coachella Valley is not always a king snake. We have 3 very charismatic black and white banded snakes here in the valley. First is our western shovel-nosed snake. These guys are tiny. They're about the size of a standard number 2 pencil at their largest. So the largest shovel-nosed snake is still usually smaller than the smallest king snake. They have a shovel-like flat snout that helps them burrow into the sand, and they're relatively variable in color, but always black banded. So this one's particularly yellow. Sometimes they will be more white and black. Sometimes they'll have a little bit of red or orange poking through those white bands, but these black saddles are pretty uniform, what we can expect to see from just about every shovel-nosed snake in the Coachella Valley. Then we have our long-nosed snake, and these guys look very much like a California king snake. But if we look closely, we can see that their nose is longer and a little bit pointier. They're quite a bit more variable in color, so they can be just black and white, or they can be black and white and red. And they're really abundant in desert habitats. I see probably 4 times as many long-nosed snakes in a year as I see California king snakes. So then we have our California king snake. This is the largest of the 3, but the ones that we tend to find are relatively similar in size to the long-nosed snakes. They're typically white or cream with really clean black bands, and they're popular with people because they're known to be rattlesnake eaters. And while this is true, king snakes can and will eat rattlesnakes, they're pretty opportunistic hunters, and so they will also eat other non-venomous snakes. They'll eat birds, they'll eat small mammals. So just because you find a king snake in your yard does not necessarily mean that your yard is going to be free from rattlesnakes. To look at these two a little bit more closely, there's some easy identification differences between the 2 of these snakes. So the first is the white spot that's going to be on top of the head of the king snake. Sometimes it's multiple white spots, but there's always at least one. I like to think of this as where his crown would go because he's a king snake, whereas our long-nosed snake has some white speckles along the side of its face, but no distinct spots on top. Then we're going to look at the black bands. On the California king snake, these black bands are really clean and crisp, whereas the long-nosed snake will always have some white patchiness coming through the black bands. This is, I think, the easiest way to tell the difference between these 2 snakes. If you can only see 1.5 inches of the snake, but you have a clear view of at least one of the black bands, you can tell which snake it is. And then last is if we look at the white bands, again, the California king snake is going to have relatively clean white bands, whereas the long-nosed snake is going to usually have a little bit of black and sometimes some red showing through. And then we have some other lookalikes in the Coachella Valley. First is our glossy snake, another one of our really abundant snakes throughout the Coachella Valley, one of the snakes that I see the most of every year. These guys are typically 10 to 24 inches, but can grow up to 48 inches long. And for some reason this year, it seems like the majority of ones that we are finding are 2 feet or longer, which is interesting because in the past, most of the ones that we have found have been between 10 and 12 inches. They get their name because their scales appear glossy. They always look like they've just freshly shed. And then we have our spotted leaf-nosed snake. These guys are so cute and they prefer sandy habitats because they're excellent burrows. Like the patch nose, they have this enlarged rostral scale on their nose that's even bigger than the patch nose. And although they look quite a bit like our glossy snake, they're also quite a bit smaller. So as adults, they're never going to be more than 12 to 20 inches long. Typically, the ones that we find are quite a bit smaller. This baby was only about 4 inches long that we found in the road. Okay, this is my favorite fun fact about snakes in general, but particularly Coachella Valley snakes, is that when we're growing up, we tend to categorize snakes as good or bad, which is venomous or non-venomous. And the truth is that venomous is a spectrum. And so some snakes fall into what we call a medically insignificant venomous category, which means that they do produce venom, but it's so mild and prey specific that it's not considered dangerous to people or common pets like our dogs and cats. This venom isn't delivered through true fangs, though they are sometimes referred to as rear fanged, but is instead delivered by chewing on their prey with grooved teeth in the back of their mouth. That means that for one of these snakes to envenomate a person, it would have to latch on to, a finger or something small and continually chew. And even then, at worst, your reaction is likely to be a little bit of swelling or itching. Not anything that is considered a medical emergency, unless, of course, you have a strange allergic reaction, which is rare. These snakes have this venom because they typically target really squirmy or slimy prey like lizards and frogs and centipedes. So first is our California lyre snake. This is my favorite snake in the Coachella Valley. They're so neat. They're unlike anything else that we have here. They can be found eating bats, even though they typically target lizards because they're crevice dwellers. And something I think is very cool about these snakes is that snakes of this same genus, Trimorphodon, also referred to as lyre snakes and that look very similar, are found in our deserts here all the way down through the rainforests of Central America. So you can go to Costa Rica and be hiking through the rainforest and find a snake that looks just like this that is also called a lyre snake. Then we have our desert night snake. These guys are just very silly little snakes. They're often found in people's pool skimmers because they like to eat frogs, so they like damp habitats. These guys are really small and they're not known for being particularly feisty. So if you find one in your pool skimmer, it is 100% safe to just scoop that snake out and put it back into the dirt. And we have some tiny snakes. These are the ones that I think of when people tell me that they are so afraid of snakes, like it's a hard no. They want nothing to do with any snakes ever because these guys are so small, it's hard to believe that anybody or anything could be afraid of them. First is our western thread snake. These guys like washes and damp habitats because they typically prey on things like ants and termites. They're a really uniform gray, silver, or pink color. This one was particularly special because it looked like somebody dropped jewelry in the road. But if you look closely at their face, you'll see that they always have these perfect round pink spots on their cheeks. So they look like a cartoon. They're the cutest thing. And then we have our western black-headed snake. They're also pretty commonly referred to as their genus name Tantilla. And they also fall into that medically insignificant venomous category, but their mouth is literally too small to bite people. I mean, you look at this snake, this is a pretty small one, but they don't get much bigger. That snake could not bite me if it tried. And they prey on centipedes, which is kind of cool because centipedes are another thing that people tend to shy away from. So you want your snakes around because they might eat your centipedes. And they're active on warm, humid nights. We rarely see these here in the Coachella Valley, but this one we happened to get lucky a couple years ago. We were looking for snakes the night after a good summer rain. And so that's when we expect these guys to come out. And then last, but certainly not least, is the gem of the desert, the rosy boa, everybody's favorite snake. These are large, heavy-bodied boas. They're the only boa in the Coachella Valley. Famously relaxed, docile snakes that are frequently seen in rocky habitats and on hillside trails at dusk and dawn. But as the season gets a little later and it stays hot a little longer into the night, they can also be found well after dark. And these snakes are perfect in every way. I always say that if everybody's first encounter with a snake was with a rosy boa, nobody would be afraid of snakes. These are the snakes that I get the most emotional about. And unfortunately, because they are so beautiful and they're so docile, they're heavily collected and poached from the Coachella Valley. So I would like to remind everybody to please let wild animals stay wild. Wild animals all have a purpose in the ecosystem. And if you are interested in having a snake as a pet, I support that. There are a lot of great snake pets. You can even get a rosy boa, but you can get one from a captive breeder. You don't need to ever take an animal from the wild. So now we're going to do some trivia. Okay, this first one. Which of these is not a California king snake? And we should have a poll going up here in just a minute so you guys can interact with this. Okay, most of you guys, it looks like got this right. I don't know why it won't let me now go to my next, there we go. So B was correct. So what's the difference? We're looking at there's white blotches coming through the black bands, there's some red blotches coming through the black bands, and they have this pointier, longer nose, which makes this a long-nosed snake. This particular individual has a lot of red, which makes it relatively easy to identify, but some long-nosed snakes will have very little or no red. And although both long-nosed snakes and California king snakes are harmless, I think this is a really great way to highlight why it's so important to use multiple visual tools when identifying snakes. If one of these species were venomous and you only went by, well, it has white and black bands and you picked it up, you could be sending yourself to the hospital. Next question, a little trickier, I think, is which of these is a California king snake? Okay, again, most of you said A, and that is correct. So how can we tell? Again, we can look at this white spots on top of the head, those clean black bands, clean white bands, whereas the rest of these snakes are missing at least one of those. So all three of these snakes are harmless and they're all abundant throughout the Coachella Valley. You'd be lucky to spot any one of them, but only A is a king snake. This one in the middle here is a Western shovel-nosed snake. You can tell based on just how big it is in my fingers that it's much too small to be even a baby king snake. And then on the right, we have two long-nosed snakes. So these are two different individuals, but they kind of highlight how variable these snakes can be. And this one on top looks a lot like a king. It even almost looks like it has a couple white spots on the head. But if you look closely, you can see some white coming through those black bands. Okay, our next question is, which of these is a rattlesnake? All right, good job. I'm so glad you guys got this one right. Our correct answer is D. This is how can we tell? First is it has that classic triangular head, the keeled overlapping scales, and the rattle on the tail, that makes this a speckled rattlesnake. This one's a juvenile, so its rattle only has a couple buttons, which, like I said, sometimes the rattles aren't super apparent, but if you look closely at the tip of the tail, you'll see it doesn't come to a clean point. It does have a little bit of a hard shell. And rattlesnakes get a new button every time that they shed. So it's an old wives' tale that you can tell how many years a snake has lived based on the number of buttons, but it's actually just how many times that snake has shed. And as snakes get quite a bit older, those rattles become really dry and brittle, and so they can break off. All right, what is the best way to avoid being bitten by a snake? A, use your hands to check for snakes that might be hidden in cracks or under bushes. B, pick up the snake by the neck or tail only. C, give snakes plenty of space and avoid putting your hands or feet in places you can't see. Or D, yell at the snake loudly to show it you aren't afraid of it. This is my hand after picking up this exact coach whip here. Coach whips are known for being particularly feisty and bitey. I knew when I grabbed it that I was very likely to get bit, but for me, the risk outweighed, or the reward outweighed the risk, because I wanted to get this snake into a safer location. Oops. Okay, and it looks like most of you said C, and that is correct. Always keep your hands and feet where you can see them. Snakes are not aggressive. They'll only bite when provoked. And again, if the snake feels safe, we stay safe. Bites from non-venomous or medically insignificant snakes in the Coachella Valley are typically not painful, and they're not considered a medical emergency even when they draw blood. And they very, very rarely result in an infection if you just clean them with soap and water when you get home. Of course, always use your best judgment. If you're bitten by a non-venomous snake, but you have an unusual reaction or you have excessive swelling, seek medical attention. Here are a couple of snakes that I was able to capture biting me or my friend. This one on the left is an Arizona mountain king snake. It's the only snake in this presentation that is not a Coachella Valley species, but I just love this photo so much. This is my friend Mel. We picked up the snake and immediately latched onto her and stayed there long enough for me to dig my phone out of my pack and get several photos. And because it wasn't hurting and Mel knows that that was just the snake's way of defending itself, she went ahead and let it bite. Our last question, which is true about snakes? A, that snakes play an important role in desert ecosystems. B, that snakes have fewer legs than lizards. C, that the Coachella Valley is lucky to have so many diverse snake species. Or D, all of the above. These two snakes, this is a California lyre snake and a juvenile rosy boa that my friend and fellow biologist Liz found kind of in the same place a few weeks ago, which was very exciting for me because these are my two favorite local species. Okay, you guys are smart. Okay, so again, it looks like most of you selected D, all of the above, and of course, this is true. Our abundance and diversity of reptiles in the Coachella Valley make it a really, truly special place to live for anybody who is interested in natural resources and wildlife. So moving forward, you guys don't have to answer this, but I want everybody to think about what are some ways that we can better support and protect our local snakes and all Coachella Valley wildlife. This could be practicing better leave no trace policies, keeping our pets indoors, planting native flora. It can also be returning land to its indigenous caretakers and indigenous people. There are a lot of ways that we can better advocate for our natural wildlife. And then what are some things that you've learned that might help you or someone you know be less afraid of snakes? Finally, here's a few additional resources if you want to keep learning about snakes, not just in the Coachella Valley, but in anywhere that you are traveling. iNaturalist is a really great app and website that helps you keep track of your sightings, confirm identifications, and contribute to community science. I will say if you use iNaturalist for reptiles, I highly recommend obscuring those data points as they are sometimes used by collectors and poachers. And then the Schechter Natural History Guide to Reptiles and Amphibians of North America is my go-to field guide when I'm traveling because it's a mobile field guide. It's on my phone. I can pull up stuff that's in the area that I'm in. And it's got a lot of really great illustrations, and it even works in minimal service areas. And then last is californiaherps.com. This is a really excellent resource for California specific reptiles and amphibians. It's got a ton of photos to look at, so you can compare the snakes that look different from one another based on what their habitat is like. It includes range maps of all of the subspecies and has some complete checklists. So if you want to start your own checklist for reptiles of California, this is where you can just find an easy one to print out. And that is all I have for you guys. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Paisley. That was wonderful. And I have to say, as someone who already enjoys rattlesnakes and other kinds of snakes, your enthusiasm is like extra infectious. Let's see. I think for my first question, I was going to ask you to answer one of your own questions that you just posed to us a little bit about sort of what you think maybe the best strategy is for talking to folks who are afraid of snakes and helping them realize or helping them get over that fear a little bit in a way that's non-confrontational.
I mean, I think there's so much. First is that like people are so afraid of snakes and so few of them are actually dangerous. And the ones that are dangerous, like rattlesnakes, are only dangerous if we interact with them in a way that makes them dangerous. So if we practice common sense and we practice respecting wildlife and native habitats, there's really no reason for us to fear snakes. And I also think for a lot of people, there's a lot, movies and media have kind of made snakes out to be the bad guy for so long. And I'm not really sure where that comes from because my interactions with snakes are that they're kind of all major babies. And, none of them want to hurt anybody. They just want to get away. So I think mostly just a better understanding of not only, how cool they can be, but also their behavior is a good way to help people get over that fear.
Great. Yeah, you can definitely, I've noticed if you read the news stories about people who get bit by rattlesnakes, you can often point to exactly where the wrong decision that they made was in the news story. It's like, don't pick it up, don't. The last one I just saw was about a guy who used his barbecue tongs to pick up a rattlesnake because he wanted to move it, right? So,
yep.
Yeah. So we're going to go to the Q&A and we've got a bunch of really great questions lined up. Susan Shiganaga wants to know what color your nails are. She loves your nail polish colors.
They're currently a kind of grayish blue. I know this is a hot topic in my reptile group because I take so many photos of snakes in hand. I am waiting for Sally Hansen to contact me for that sponsorship. And it's the only reason I keep up with having clean, well-manicured nails is because I take so many photos of my hands.
So she has a question at the end, maybe to bring it back to snakes. Can snakes tell the difference, or do snakes see in color, or do they care what color your fingernails are?
That's a good question. I'm not like a taxonomist. I don't know a ton about snake biology. My sort of area of expertise is more in human interaction with wildlife and sort of ecology as a whole. And so I'm not entirely sure that they can tell the color. I mean, I know that they can see us, they can see us, and I know that they can feel from the vibrations on the ground when we're coming, but I'm not sure what their eyesight is like.
Yeah. They do have pretty good sense of smell, right? Or sense of taste through smell. Do you ever notice, like, if you have a certain lotion on or something like that, that they might be more agitated or less agitated, anything like that?
Not that I've noticed. I tend to try to avoid wearing anything or putting anything on my hands that might upset snakes. So like even my sunscreen, after I apply my sunscreen, I try to make sure if I'm going to be handling any reptiles that my hands are as clean as possible. I do know that when we are handling snakes, we do see them flicking their tongue out a lot. So I know that they are smelling us and trying to get an idea of what is going on. But because I'm not a person who wears a lot of scents, that'd be a good, I think, test to maybe bring out a couple friends and have each of us wear something a little bit different, but that we know won't hurt the animal, and see if they react any differently.
Yeah. So we have another question from Michael Alexander, which you covered a little bit, but if you have any other comments, maybe you can add. He wants to know if snakes eat other snakes.
Yeah, a lot of snakes eat other snakes. Predominantly king snakes are known for eating other snakes. Gopher snakes have been observed eating other snakes. And then even some of our smaller snakes will sometimes eat other small snakes, but king snakes are the ones that we most typically associate with being, sort of cannibalistic and eating other snakes. Most of our snakes here in the desert target small rodents, pocket mice and kangaroo rats. But then there are a couple others. Coachwhips have been observed eating other snakes, but they typically target lizards and birds. So in the Coachella Valley, really the king snake is the one that we really associate with being a snake eater.
Our next question is from G. Freeman, I think. And he wants to know at what altitude does one no longer see rattlesnakes? And he wants to, if you can, talk about the impact of climate change and on snakes that are found in the Coachella Valley. Do we know?
Cool. I'm not sure a ton about the altitude. I know that there are, some of our snakes, like the Southern Pacific rattlesnake is found at much higher altitudes than here. When you get into Arizona, there are some other snakes that prefer high altitudes. Because my focus is generally on Coachella Valley snakes and we are low desert, I'm not entirely sure about high altitude habitat for snakes. I'm sure there are some that like really high altitudes, but none of our snakes here. Kind of the cool thing about the Coachella Valley is because we are low desert and low altitude, we have more species of rattlesnake here than most places in California outside of the Coachella Valley, with the exception of maybe like the Borrego Valley, which is very similar to us. And then as far as climate change, climate change impacts everything, right? So it's been surprising that this year, having it be so dry, we're actually seeing more snakes on average than I have in previous years, which we would think that there wouldn't be because there's less food. However, it could also be that they are moving further to find food. So we might see them more because they're being more active. Luckily, because snakes are, at least our snakes here in the Coachella Valley, are used to a really dry, arid climate. So far, they seem to be doing okay. However, it's, a matter of time if things don't change before it gets even too hot and too dry to support either our rattlesnakes or their line of food. So as we start seeing fewer wildflowers and then we start seeing fewer rodents, we're going to start seeing fewer snakes.
Yeah, it's true. I can say, as far as the altitude question, that they do have speckled rattlesnakes up on the tram, so they go pretty high.
Yeah, speckled rattlesnakes are kind of a weird one that they just seem to be found everywhere. But
Everywhere,
they
yeah.
Different everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And then Roberta asks if snakes eat rabbits.
They can. Most of our snakes here don't get quite big enough to eat rabbits. A large red diamond rattlesnake or a large gopher snake could, absolutely. I did see a Western Diamondback rattlesnake a couple years ago in Arizona who had just finished chowing down a cottontail. The thing about eating something as large as a rabbit is it completely immobilizes the snake. So they can eat something that big, but it also makes them vulnerable. Whereas eating several things like kangaroo rats or pocket mouse or ground squirrels that are a little smaller is likely more beneficial to the snake, even though it's more work. Because the one that we saw that had just eaten a cottontail, couldn't move for about 3 days while it digested that meal. And luckily it was in a place where it was safe, but it also makes that snake highly vulnerable. It can't fit into a burrow to hide. It's kind of just stuck in a corner until it can move again.
Yeah, that's true. Timothy Cronshaw has a question about sort of strategy if someone is unfortunately bitten by a rattlesnake when you're out in the backcountry and you're in a group. So he wants to know if it's better to have the person who's been bit stay still and have the other people go and get help, or should we all go out together?
I think a lot of that depends on the severity of the bite and also how far that trek is. If you get bitten on the arm or something where you feel like you can, as comfortably as possible, walk out with your group, then that probably means you're going to get to medical assistance faster. But if you are way out there and you're bit on the leg and you can't walk on it, then it might be better to send 1 or 2 buddies out to get cell service, as long as they can have a GPS location so they know where to send help.
That's good advice. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who wants to know how thick the bigger gopher snakes were in your pictures, and are they also long and narrow?
Gopher snakes tend to be, so part of the reason gopher snakes are so frequently misidentified as rattlesnakes is they are very heavy bodied snakes. Gopher snakes are the largest snakes in California by probably not so much by weight. I'm sure some of our rattlesnakes are heavier, but gopher snakes do get pretty round. I don't have an exact measurement, but larger, almost similar to the boas, except different shaped. But they're pretty heavy bodied snakes. The one that I found was only, about 16 inches long. So it was relatively thin. It was about the size of what we'd expect for a long-nosed snake or a California king snake. But they do get pretty heavy bodied, especially when you get into the ones that are 5 and 6 feet long. So they do, as adults, look much more like rattlesnakes.
Great. Irene Rosen wants to know how you catch red racers when they're so fast. And she says, thanks for the great presentation.
It's tough. That one that I had a picture of me holding, I found just last weekend when I had a friend visiting, and it's the first one I've had in hand that was alive in about 6 years. Because normally when we see them, they're just moving. They're so far gone. And this one, we got really lucky. We spotted it. It was sort of just on the trail. And because we spotted it before it spotted us, I was able to quickly grab it and then move it away from the trail. Since there were some families with small children nearby, we wanted to make sure that they didn't get spooked and hurt themselves, and also that they didn't hurt the snake. So you just got to be really fast. And sometimes even when you think you can catch one, it just makes its way into a burrow before you get close to it.
I've had them occasionally kind of play dead until you get real close and then they take off. Yeah.
Yeah, with that one, I think it was just early enough in the day that it wasn't completely warmed up yet. So snakes, like all reptiles, when they're cooler, they tend to be a little slower and more sluggish. Whereas as they warm up throughout the day or throughout the night, then they reach top speed.
Roberta wants to know, or asks if you can please repeat the time frame for when you're most likely to encounter snakes. I don't know if that's in the year or during the day, but maybe both.
Yeah, so in the year, here in the Coachella Valley, our sort of most active season is kind of March through May. So this kind of spring to summer transition. And then we see another spike, particularly of baby snakes, at the end of the summer. So like September through October, and then sometimes even into November, we see another spike. But even snakes have a threshold for heat. So July and August, we don't see quite as many of them. And then as for the time of day, it really depends on what kind of snake you're looking for. The majority of our snakes are nocturnal, so we find them well after dark. But early in the season, you might find some of them out during the day, like rosy boas and king snakes are frequently seen on trails in the middle of the day, early in the season when it's not quite hot enough at night yet. So it really just depends on what snake you're looking for, and what kind of snakes are in the area that you're at. But typically I would say May after dark is your best chance of encountering one. or first thing in the morning.
We have another anonymous attendee who has a question that I've heard as well, which wants to know if the desert hospitals carry antivenom. And during a previous lecture, we had somebody mention that only Loma Linda carries antivenom, so you have to go for a distance to get some if you have to get treatment.
Yeah, I've heard mixed things. I've heard that Eisenhower carries it, but I also have heard that they don't. So what I would do is, again, kind of depending on the severity of the bite, if it's a really severe bite, just get to the closest hospital, and the hospital will arrange for either getting you to a place that has antivenom or getting antivenom in stock themselves. If I were bit on the hand and I thought I could get myself to Loma Linda, I might just go straight there. So you have to make some judgment calls. If you aren't familiar with snakes or snake bites and rattlesnakes, just get to the closest hospital, and that's going to be your best bet. They will take care of you from there.
Is there any way to, or how long does it take, I guess, to realize whether you've gotten a dry bite or a bite that actually had venom?
Probably within minutes if you are familiar with snake bites.
Yeah.
You aren't and you get bit, I would think that the shock is probably enough that you just want to assume that it's not. I would say that even if you're bit and even if you are familiar with snake bites, never assume that it's a dry bite. If by the time you get to the hospital and they can assess you, your doctor might say, hey, I don't think we need antivenom treatment. There doesn't seem to be a clear envenomation here. But if you're bit, especially if you're bit by something you know is a venomous snake, just get to the hospital as quickly as possible.
Let's see. We have a question about the way to tell the difference between a glossy snake and a gopher snake. It's kind of an easy way.
Yeah, so gopher snakes tend to be more active during the day and glossy snakes at night, but we do sometimes see, gopher snakes out at night. When you see them in person, they're kind of easy to tell the difference because gopher snakes tend to be quite a bit darker, and gopher snakes have this sort of satin matte finish, right? So they're really soft to the touch, whereas glossy snakes, as their name implies, are really glossy and shiny. So you look at them, it's like choosing different finishes for your wall paint. So they just look very different. And also gopher snakes tend to have sort of a more keeled scale texture, whereas glossy snakes have that really smooth interlocking scales.
Let's see, we have a lot of questions still, so I'm going to kind of pick over a few. Jenny's asking about how often snakes shed and why. You answered that a little bit, but maybe just expand on that a little bit.
So they shed as they grow, and so how often they shed is going to depend a lot on where that snake is in its life cycle. Young snakes are likely to shed more often because they're growing a little more quickly, but also snakes are probably going to shed more frequently early in the season when it's spring and everything is active and they're eating more frequently, whereas a snake's not likely to shed while it's overwintering and it's not eating, it's going for a long time. So they shed as they grow, basically to better fit into their skin. So it's hard to say exactly how frequently they shed because every snake is going to be a little bit different.
Bettina has a question about snakes getting secondary rat poisoning and whether if they eat poison rats or things like that, if that's a problem for snakes.
Yes, just like it's a problem for anything that eats, unfortunately, rat poison that's going to affect, it's not only going to affect the snake, but then as the snake starts to get sick, it's going to affect whatever eats the snake, because that snake is then going to go on to be eaten by a hawk or a coyote or a bobcat. And so it's everything down the food chain is going to get sick. So don't use rat poisons.
Here. Murray wants to know about king snakes eating venomous snakes and how the non-venomous snakes are able to do that. Are they immune to the venom or?
Yeah, so king snakes are pretty much immune to rattlesnake venom. And they're only going to target smaller rattlesnakes, right? So like a full-grown king snake is probably not going to target a full-grown rattlesnake because the full-grown rattler is going to be much larger than the king snake. But also king snakes are incredibly fast. We don't think of them that way because when we watch them moving, they tend to move pretty slowly. They're not usually very afraid of people. However, they're constrictors. So they're going to grab a rattlesnake and they're going to immediately constrict it, sometimes before that snake even knows what is happening. And they're going to strangle that snake and it doesn't have a chance. But they are also immune to the rattlesnake venom.
So we have a few questions that I can kind of lump into like rattlesnake myths and questions. So there's the old one about the baby rattlesnakes injecting more venom. So maybe you can address that one real quickly.
Not true at all.
Yeah.
So the myth is that baby rattlesnakes can't control their venom, and so they dump their whole payload, and that's just not true. All rattlesnakes are born with the ability to control the amount of venom that they inject. And so if anything, a bite from an adult rattlesnake might possibly be more dangerous because they're going to have larger venom glands. They're going to be able to produce more venom. But ultimately, it doesn't matter the size or age of the rattlesnake. They are all dangerous, all medically significant, and you should just avoid handling any of them if you want to keep your fingers.
And we have another one about snakes that are evolving to use their rattle less because I guess the quiet snakes live longer potentially.
Yeah, there's some contesting data about this. There's some people believe that in areas where there are a lot of wild boars, rattlesnakes are losing their ability to rattle because they've learned that being quiet keeps them safe. Similar in areas like agricultural areas where if the people don't see the snake, they're less likely to kill it. But it's sort of a new thing. And as we know, evolution happens over a long period of time. So there is one species of rattlesnake that has lost its rattle, and it's the Santa Catalina Island rattlesnake. It's not found in the Coachella Valley, but generally we just sort of don't quite know enough yet about that adaptation and if it's really changing, and also if it's changing, we can't quite yet pinpoint an exact reason why.
We have another question about rattlesnakes. Is it true that rattlesnakes cannot bite through denim? And do you recommend, or do you have a material for leg gaiters, or even a particular leg gaiter that you would recommend? Or do you recommend leg gaiters?
So rattlesnakes can bite through denim. The thing with a rattlesnake bite is there was a study that showed that your bite was like 40% more likely to be a dry bite if you were wearing denim. And rattlesnakes, because they can control their venom, there's like a weird thing where when they bite you, they're not trying to eat you. So they don't necessarily want to inject you, but we know that fangs are hollow and they can contain venom regardless. So anytime you get punctured by a rattlesnake fang, even if it's a taxidermy rattlesnake or one that is, a museum specimen in a jar, you have to watch for an envenomation. There is some science that backs this idea that wearing denim or long jeans is going to be, you're more likely to end up with a dry bite, but it's not because the snake can't penetrate the denim. I don't typically wear snake gaiters because here in the desert, there's not a lot of shrubs that we're walking through. So we can usually see everywhere that we put our feet. But if you were going into an area that had a lot of tall grass, or you were walking through an environment where you can't see where your feet are going, then I would absolutely recommend wearing snake gaiters. I don't have a particular brand. The ones that I have, I bought because a friend sent me a link to them. And I've only had to use them once. But typically here in the desert, and if you're just hiking on the trails, if you watch where you're stepping, you don't need to worry about snake gaiters.
Okay, there's a bunch of questions about your tattoo and whether you'd be willing to show us a better look at it. And people want to know what it is and whether it's a native species.
This is this is an Oregon pipe rosy boa. So it's a rosy boa that's very similar to our ones here, but in Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, which is my absolute favorite park of all time down in southern Arizona. Their species, the rosy boa there, it's also called the Mexican rosy boa, looks just like ours, except instead of being gray and pink, they're black and white. And this is a snake I had been looking for years. And then I finally took, a few years ago, two of my close friends on a herp trip down to Arizona. It was my first time leading that trip and not going with other biologists who knew where we were going. And one of the first snakes we found was this snake that I had been looking for years. So it's one of my favorite snake encounters of all time, was this rosy boa that's just like the ones we have here, except different colors.
Good story. Let's see. There's a few questions about rattlesnakes and dogs, and like how to keep people whose dogs aren't afraid of snakes, and is there a way to keep them out of the yard?
So
Is there like a particular kind of fencing or something like that?
yeah, so I mean, I would highly recommend rattlesnake avoidance training. If your dog is not afraid of snakes, rattlesnake avoidance training is great to help teach your dogs to just stay away from snakes. As far as keeping them out of your yard, you can try putting up, rattlesnakes aren't particularly great wall climbers. You can put up a wall. Things like snake netting aren't great because snakes and other wildlife can get tangled in them and then they get killed, and that's not usually the intention behind those things. You want to keep animals out, not kill them in their attempt to get in. The best way to deter rattlesnakes from your yard is to just keep a really clean yard. If your yard or your space isn't inviting to rodents and things that rattlesnakes eat, it's not going to be inviting to rattlesnakes.
So we have a couple of, let's see here. A couple of maybe kind of fun questions. Someone wants to know what the smelliest snake is.
So from what I hear, garter snakes are the smelliest snakes. The only garter snakes in the Coachella Valley, they weren't in my presentation because I've not yet found them, and they're only found in riparian habitat. So it's the two-striped garter snake can be found in the Indian canyons and in whitewater, and that's about it in the Coachella Valley. My experience with snakes is that long-nosed snakes have the smelliest musk. It's pretty bad. They don't musk often, but when they do, it's rough. And blind snakes don't have a particularly smelly musk, but when they musk a lot. Like for as long as they're in your hand, they're musking you. And so then you just end up with musk everywhere, and you rub it on your pants, and then your pants stink. And Kestrel loves when I come home after getting musked by a snake. But yeah, any snake that you pick up has the ability to musk you, and it's not dangerous to you or anything, but it is a smelly process, and that smell does kind of linger even after you wash your hands and use hand sanitizer.
Someone wants to know how long do snakes live?
So that can depend on the type of snake, and also, of course, we know snakes in captivity tend to live a little bit longer, but like our big rattlesnakes can live 20 years if they're out of the way of people, not going across the road where they're going to get hit too frequently. Smaller snakes tend to not have quite as long of a lifespan. So it's usually the larger the snake, I think the longer the lifespan, at least that I'm familiar with our local species. But unfortunately, the biggest threat to snakes is not old age, it's predators and cars.
Yeah. So we have a few more questions left, but I think we're like getting to the end of our Zoom time. So maybe I'll just ask if folks want to get a hold of you. We have some questions about whether you'd be willing to, or if you do hikes or anything like that. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, if they have questions about snakes that they want to follow up with, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, I haven't done any, hikes or anything yet, but it's certainly something I am hoping to do. I can be found on Facebook. You can come to the Palm Springs Reptile Appreciation Group, and everybody's welcome to send me. You can either make a post in that group, or you can send me a direct message. You can email me, paisleyr@ucr.edu. I'm pretty open. Any way you can find to get a hold of me.
Instagram, I think, is pretty good, right?
Yeah, I'm Paisley in the Desert on Instagram, and I'm always open to talking about snakes and wildlife with anybody who's interested.
Well, great, and thank you again for your presentation, and thank you all for being here with us and learning about rattlesnakes, and not just rattlesnakes, all snakes in the Coachella Valley. Save the date for our next Wild Coachella lecture, which is coming up. It's not quite a month away, it's sooner than that. On June 9th, we'll be talking with Paul Byer about conserving cougars, mountain lions, and wildlife corridors in urbanizing Southern California. So we've heard a lot about that in the news over the last few years, and I'm certainly very interested to hear what he has to say about how the developments in that topic. And I think with that, we're all set. So someone's going to turn off the Zoom chat for us pretty soon here tonight. Everybody have a good night. Stay safe. See some rattlesnakes and don't pick them up.